Hey, this is Chris, keeping it real. How you doing? I've been trying to do this video for like the last 20 minutes, and everywhere I drove, the sun was right in the camera somewhere. It was either on me, and I was too bright for the camera picture, or the sun was literally right back there. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about some Civil War history. I'm finishing up the autobiography of William Tecumseh Sherman, and I've got about, I don't know, 50 pages to go. It's a fairly long book. It's like 600. Well, it's actually a 2-volume work. It's been put into one book, but it's like 600 pages. Very interesting. But one of the things that, I've been thinking about as I've read the book, and it occurred to me last night, trying to get like a big picture of what happened in the southernmost states during the Civil War, as far as what Sherman and Grant, what they called it, the Western Army, but today we would call it, I don't know what we would call it, the not quite so East Army. But anyway, yeah, the army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Ohio, all those armies that Sherman was in command of. And his antagonist, his opposing general, was a guy named Joseph A. Johnston, who was a very tactically and strategically minded individual. And so when Sherman, after Vicksburg, when Grant went back east to become commander-in-chief, and Sherman was left to deal with Johnston and to try to sweep through the South, take Atlanta, and then see where it went from there. And so he did that. He started driving towards Atlanta. This, of course, is a greatly simplified overview of what happened, but as he continued to drive towards Atlanta, the Confederate leadership in Richmond became more and more concerned about Johnston's lack of aggressiveness. Now, there was a good reason for Johnston's lack of aggressiveness, and that's because his army wasn't big enough to do anything to stop Sherman's army. Of course, it also wasn't big enough, and it wasn't good enough. Sherman was a much better commander, much better grasp of tactical and strategic thinking than Johnston was. But Johnston was still a good general, and he knew how to trade land for time, which is what you do when you're fighting, basically what amounted to a delaying action, as he backed his way across Georgia. But there really wasn't any other way to do it. I mean, Sherman wasn't one of these dumb generals from the North, or from the United States, that were afraid, like, for example, McClellan, who wouldn't attack even if he had a 10-to-1 advantage. He wasn't one of those guys. He's like, if he saw an opportunity to do something useful, he would do it, and he wouldn't hesitate to do it, which is why Grant gave him so much leeway in what he did. Again and again throughout the book, especially towards the latter part of it, when Sherman is on his own as the commander of that army, Grant's like, here's kind of what I want you to do, but I'm going to leave all the details up to you. I'm not going to worry about it. What a great testimony to how good Sherman really was. So anyway, the Southern leadership is getting frustrated with the lack of offensive operations, let's say. And so they replaced Johnston with John Bell Hood, who is much known to be a much more aggressive commander. He's lost a leg and an arm to prove it. Or maybe he was blind in one eye and lost a leg. I cannot remember. I need to read back through that. Anyway, he'd suffered 2 major wounds in battle. Back then the generals fought, and they were close to the line, and a lot of them got killed. And so that was the nature of war back then. And so Hood takes over, and Hood, I don't think he wasn't dumb at all, but I think at some point, and he wasn't reckless to the point of being stupid about it, but I think at some point he had to do something. He had to live up to his reputation as being an aggressive commander, and so he did, and Sherman promptly eviscerated his army, and so Hood had to withdraw. And so there was literally no Confederate army around Atlanta anymore. Hood withdrew and went back northwest towards Tennessee. to regroup, refit, get more recruits, get supplies, get shoes for his soldiers, stuff like the stuff you don't really think about when you think about armies, but yeah, all those things are very important. And so he left, and kind of his hope was that he could draw Sherman back towards Tennessee and away from Atlanta. But Sherman had already been formulating this march to the sea in his mind, and he got to Atlanta, and he got his troops gathered, reformed, gathered up, got them fed, got supplies for them, destroyed all the military objectives in Atlanta. One of the things about, I think, one of the great mischaracterizations of Sherman is that he just indiscriminately destroyed everything in his path. Now they did take forage, they did take supplies from the civilians, absolutely, but they didn't just go through Atlanta burning everything to the ground. I mean, if it was a military objective, he burned it to the ground. If it wasn't, he left it alone, unless, of course, somebody made trouble for him, and then he had to make an example of it. But that was very kind of a rare occurrence, really, amazingly, given his reputation. And so Hood's out of the way. And so the important thing I want you to understand is Hood's out of the way. Sherman formulates his plan to go to the sea. With Hood being out of the way, Sherman is free to do that. If Johnston had stayed in command, Johnston would not have launched any foolhardy attacks. Johnston would not have wasted his men. Johnston would have been this constant force in front of Sherman, not only on the march to Savannah, but also on the equally important march up through South Carolina into North Carolina, where Sherman freely admits if the Confederates had been able to put together any kind of force, they could have at several points along the way mounted a stiff enough resistance to stop the United States Army. And so that's how that one decision to replace Johnston with Hood made such a huge difference in the course of the war, because it would have been completely different. Because we don't know what would have happened. They could have drug. I mean, at that point in the war, all the Confederates had to do was drag it out for another year, another 2 years. Everybody was sick and tired of it. Everybody in the United States was tired of it. But, and when I say United States, I mean the states that were still loyal to the Constitution. Okay, let me just clarify that whole idea, because the Confederacy was not loyal to the Constitution. They were not part of the United States anymore. So let's just keep our terminology straight, and then we can move on from there. But if Johnston had remained in command, he could have likely stopped Sherman in the manner, he would have stopped Sherman from doing what Sherman wanted to do and what he wanted to accomplish. Because the overall scheme of things was for Sherman to come up north through North Carolina into southern Virginia, pincer Lee, and that'd be the end of the war. And so there was nobody to, I mean, I think the most remarkable thing is I was reading his account of that march. I mean, it was like 720 miles altogether. 300 miles to Savannah, 420 miles up through Fayetteville, into Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where my parents live, by the way. All that distance, no real opposition. I mean, here and there. Not until Bentonville, when Johnston, ironically, shows up, having been brought back in command of a rather sizable army that was made up of the remnants of Hood's army, which had been destroyed by, the United States general in Tennessee, who was okay once he got started. General Thomas, basically destroyed Hood's army. The remainder of that army came east into North Carolina. Johnston retook command. I don't know if Hood was killed. I don't know if Sherman says. But ironically, right, Johnston was there. He could have stopped the whole thing, but he was there at the end. But by then it was too late. And then finally Johnston surrendered to Sherman. So the end of the war could have been extended, 6 months, a year, whatever. And who knows what might have happened politically. That was the big thing. It was, by the end of the war, it was the political situation that was more important than the military situation. The United States just needed enough time to finally crush the Confederates. It was just a matter of whether or not the people of the United States were willing to put up with all those casualties. So the end of the war could have been much different. So I just wanted to share that with you. If you're into history, you know, let me know what you think about that theory, hypothesis. It's an hypothesis. I can't prove it. If you're not, and I hope you've learned something. I mean, it's like American history is important because we are Americans, and so it's good to understand, you know, why things happen, and so you know, so that we can keep doing the good things that happen and stop repeating the mistakes of the bad things. All right. Got any questions or comments? Leave them in the section below. Like and subscribe. We appreciate when you do. We'll see you on the next historical video.